The morning Priya Mehta laughed at a man for wearing paint-stained shoes to a job interview was the same morning her entire understanding of her own life cracked open like dry earth after rain. She didn't know it yet. She was standing at the glass wall of her corner office on the 14th floor of Mehta Consolidated, watching the lobby below through narrowed eyes, coffee cup warm in her perfectly manicured hands. The man sitting in the waiting area, the one her assistant Roshni had quietly flagged as the last candidate for the facilities manager position, was wearing a faded blue-collared shirt that had been ironed so carefully you could almost see the effort in every crease. His trousers were clean but slightly short. And his shoes, dark brown leather Oxfords that had once been handsome, were speckled with pale white paint that no amount of scrubbing had fully removed. Priya turned to her head of HR, Marcus, who stood beside her reviewing a tablet, and said something she would spend the rest of her life wishing she could take back. She said, with a small, dismissive laugh, that she didn't know why they were wasting time interviewing a man who couldn't even dress appropriately for a job application. She said it quietly, almost to herself. But Roshni heard. Marcus heard. And somewhere in the universe, the truth heard, and began making its way toward her. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear this today, and subscribe to Kindness Vault, because stories like this one deserve to be seen. His name was Avik Sharma. He was 34 years old, and he had driven 40 minutes to this interview in a car that stalled twice at red lights and required him to hold the driver's side window up manually whenever it rained. He had woken at 5 that morning, made breakfast for his 7-year-old daughter Meenu, packed her school bag, braided her hair, badly, imperfectly, in the way fathers learn to braid when there is no one else, and dropped her at school with a kiss on her forehead before driving to the far side of the city for a job interview he had spent 3 nights preparing for. The paint on his shoes was from the apartment building where he worked part-time as a maintenance helper on weekends. He had gotten the stain the previous Sunday while repainting a hallway for a landlord who paid him 300 rupees for 4 hours of work. He had scrubbed the shoes that morning. He had scrubbed them until his knuckles hurt. But white paint on dark leather remembers itself, no matter how hard you try to forget it. Avik had not always lived this way. There had been a time, not so long ago, when he had been an assistant project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, earning a steady income, living in a decent 2-bedroom flat, married to a woman named Sunita who sang to herself while cooking and laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. That life had ended quietly and without drama, not in a single catastrophic moment but in a slow erosion. First the firm had downsized. Then Sunita had gotten sick, not dramatically, not in the way films show illness, but in the way real illness works, which is to say gradually and then suddenly. She was gone before Meenu turned 3, and Avik had been trying to find solid ground ever since, one paint-stained day at a time. He waited in that lobby for 47 minutes. He sat up straight. He kept his hands folded in his lap. He smiled politely at the receptionist when she glanced over. He did not fidget. He had learned, in the years since losing everything soft in his life, that dignity was not something the world gave you, it was something you held onto yourself, with both hands, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. When Roshni finally came to tell him, gently, with an apology in her eyes that she could not quite voice, that the position had already been filled internally, Avik simply nodded, thanked her, and walked back to the elevator. He did not argue. He did not show the weight of what that rejection meant, that he had used his last tank of petrol to come here, that Meenu's school fees were due in 11 days, that the maintenance job paid barely enough to cover groceries. He simply pressed the elevator button and looked straight ahead, and Roshni stood there watching him go, feeling something she couldn't name settle heavily in her chest. What happened next was not planned by anyone. It was the kind of thing that happens in life when the universe decides enough time has passed and the lesson is overdue. Priya's father, Suresh Mehta, the man who had built Mehta Consolidated from a 2-room office and a borrowed telephone, had died 8 months earlier. He had been a quiet, private man who kept his emotions close and his history closer. In all her 41 years, Priya had never seen her father cry, never heard him speak about his childhood in any detail, never once seen him look at a photograph with anything other than polite acknowledgement. He was not a cold man. He was simply a sealed one, a man who had learned somewhere along the way that the past was a room better left locked. After his death, Priya had been slowly, reluctantly, going through the boxes in his study. It was the kind of task that grief makes both urgent and impossible at the same time. She had been avoiding the last box, a small brown one sealed with tape that had yellowed with age, for 3 months. She opened it that evening, still wearing her office clothes, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her father's study with a glass of wine she had forgotten to drink. Inside the box were papers, a few old letters, a wristwatch she didn't recognize, and at the very bottom, tucked inside a folded cotton handkerchief, a photograph. It was black and white, slightly bent at one corner, and showed a young man, barely 19 or 20, standing in front of a modest building with a paint roller in his hand, wearing work clothes and shoes covered in white paint. He was grinning. Not smiling, grinning, with the unguarded joy of someone who has just done something they're proud of and has no reason to hide it. It was her father. Priya had never seen this photograph. She had never, in 41 years, seen her father's face arranged in quite that expression. The openness of it, the sheer uncomplicated happiness, made her breath catch in a way she hadn't expected. She turned the photograph over with shaking hands. On the back, in her father's careful handwriting, were 7 words, "First job. Painted the whole wall myself." She sat there for a long time. She thought about what it must have taken for a young man with paint on his shoes and pride in his hands to walk into rooms where people like her now sat and judged and dismissed. She thought about her father's sealed silences, and suddenly understood them differently, not as coldness but as protection, the protective silence of a man who had once been vulnerable and learned the cost of it. She thought about the look on Roshni's face when she returned to the office that afternoon. She thought about a blue-collared shirt, carefully ironed. She thought about paint-stained shoes scrubbed clean as they could go. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. It was 9:30 at night. He answered on the second ring. Avik was helping Minu with a drawing. She was making a lion, she told him, though it looked more like a very confident cloud, when his phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up, some quiet instinct he'd learned to trust in the years since learning that small moments could change directions. It was Roshni. She spoke quickly, as though if she slowed down she might lose her nerve. She told him the position hadn't actually been filled internally. She told him there had been a misunderstanding. She told him, and her voice went careful and soft here, that the CEO of Meta Consolidated would like to personally offer him the role, with a salary that made Avik's hand tighten around the phone, and that she was sorry for what had happened that afternoon, more sorry than she could properly say on a phone call. There was a silence on the line. Minu looked up from her lion cloud and studied her father's face with the seriousness only children and poets possess. Avik asked only one question. He asked whether the apology was coming from the company or from the person. Roshni paused, and then said it was from the person. He said he would think about it overnight and call back in the morning. And then he set the phone down and sat very still for a moment, feeling the strange, disorienting sensation of a door opening in a hallway you had given up walking down. The next morning, Priya Mehta arrived at the office before anyone else. She stood in the empty lobby, by the chairs where Avik had waited the day before, and she looked at the shoes she was wearing, Italian leather, spotlessly clean, effortlessly expensive, and she felt the full weight of what she had said behind a glass wall while a man sat quietly below her with ironed creases in his shirt and dignity in the set of his shoulders. She had already called her father's old foreman, the one name she'd found in the box alongside the photograph, and learned the story her father had never told her, that Suresh Mehta had arrived in the city at 19 with no connections and a second-hand paint roller, that his first job had been painting a hallway in a building where the owner had laughed at his worn shoes, and that the man who had given him a chance anyway, the building's facilities manager, had changed the entire course of his life with a single act of basic human decency. When Avik walked into the lobby that morning, Priya was waiting. She introduced herself without her title. She showed him the photograph. She didn't make a speech. She simply placed it in his hands and told him that her father had smiled in exactly one photograph in his entire documented life, and that he'd been wearing paint on his shoes when it was taken, and that she was sorry it had taken her this long to understand what that meant. Avik looked at the photograph for a long moment. He thought about Minu's braided hair. He thought about Sunita laughing at her own unfinished jokes. He thought about the walls he had painted and the floors he had scrubbed and the mornings he had held himself together with nothing but the promise of his daughter's face at the end of the day. He thought about dignity, how it wasn't loud, wasn't impressive, didn't need an audience. He handed the photograph back to Priya carefully, with both hands, and said simply that he would like to start on Monday if that was all right. She said Monday was perfect. If this story moved something in you today, if it reminded you that every person in a waiting room has a world behind their eyes, please share this video with someone who needs to believe that kindness still exists. Like it, comment below what part touched your heart, and let Kindness Vault know you were here. Before you go, drop a comment that says, "Paint and Pride," if this story stayed with you. It helps more people find stories that matter. Avik still has those shoes. He keeps them in the back of his wardrobe, still paint-stained, still refusing to come fully clean. On the days when the new job is hard, and sometimes it is, because life does not become simple just because one door opens, he takes them out and looks at them. Not with shame. Not anymore. Minu, who is now 8, once found them and asked why he kept broken shoes. He told her they weren't broken. He told her that some things carry marks that prove they were used for something real, something that mattered, something that required showing up even when it was hard. She thought about this for a moment, with the gravity that small children bring to big ideas, and then she said that they sounded like brave shoes. He agreed that they were exactly that.